The snow bit into Elena's bare feet like 1,000 tiny teeth, each step sending jolts of pain up through her frozen legs. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, hadn't been able to for what felt like hours, but she forced herself forward through the dark forest, her thin sleeping shift doing nothing against the brutal winter wind that cut through the thornwood like a blade. Behind her, the howls had faded. That should have brought relief. But Elena knew better. They weren't chasing her because they didn't need to. Where could a cursed, worthless Omega possibly run? The nearest pack territory was Shadowfang, and everyone knew those lands were ruled by a broken Alpha King, a male so savage he'd watched his entire pack burn and done nothing to stop it. At least that's what they said. Better a savage stranger than what waits for me if I go back. The thought pushed her forward when her body begged to stop, to curl up against one of the frost-covered pines and let the cold take her. It would be peaceful, she imagined, like falling asleep, like finally being free of the looks, the whispers, the hands that would soon have the right to touch her however they pleased. Elena's stomach lurched, and she stumbled, catching herself against rough bark that scraped her already bleeding palms. The healer's words echoed in her skull, a drumbeat of condemnation that had followed her through every frozen mile. 3 tests, 3 failures. The womb is cursed, Alpha. She will never carry viable young. Marta's voice had been clinical, detached, as if she were discussing a lame horse rather than Elena's entire future. The old healer had pressed her withered hand against Elena's bare stomach, and Elena had felt something cold seep into her skin, the diagnostic magic all pack healers carried. The seed cannot take root, Marta had continued, addressing Alpha Vance as if Elena weren't even in the room, as if she hadn't just heard her death sentence. Her body rejects it. I've never seen anything quite like it. The womb itself is healthy, but something blocks the conception. Something unnatural. Cursed. The word had spread through the Thornwood pack like wildfire, but Elena remembered her grandmother's voice, soft and secret in the darkness of their shared room, before the old woman had died. You're not cursed, child. You're waiting. Our bloodline carries something ancient, something sleeping. It will wake when it finds what it's meant for. Her grandmother had gripped her hand with surprising strength, eyes clouded with fever but blazing with urgency. I've hidden us, Elena. Wrapped our scent in magic so old even I barely remember the words. The ones who hunt our bloodline, they must never find you. Promise me you'll never speak of this. Promise me you'll let them think you're nothing. Elena had promised, terrified by the desperation in her grandmother's voice. 2 days later, the old woman was dead, taking most of her secrets with her. Elena had never understood what she meant, had thought it was just the ramblings of a dying mind. But sometimes, late at night, she felt something stirring deep inside her, something that had nothing to do with her dormant wolf. She'd heard the whispers about herself for years, ever since she'd come of age at 18 and the mandatory breeding tests had begun. Every unmated female of childbearing age was required to submit to them, not actual matings, but magical examinations where the pack healer would test fertility by introducing treated samples to the womb and measuring the body's response. Clinical, cold, degrading. The pack's future depended on strong bloodlines, Alpha Vance always said. They couldn't afford to waste resources on females who couldn't contribute. Elena had failed the first test at 18. Her body had rejected the sample within seconds, as if it were poison. The second at 20, with the same result. And now, at 22, the third and final test had sealed her fate. 3 different males' samples. 3 instant rejections. The healer had never seen anything like it. She could still see the look on Alpha Vance's face when Marta had delivered the verdict. Not disappointment. He'd expected this. No, his expression had been something far worse. Satisfaction. Such a waste, he'd said, circling her like a predator. Elena had stood frozen in the healing hall, wearing only the thin examination shift, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold her shattering world together. You're not unpleasant to look at, Elena. strong enough for labor. But what use is an Omega who can't breed? She hadn't answered. What could she have said? The Border Patrol has been restless. Vance had stopped behind her, and she'd felt his breath on her neck, hot and sour with the mead he'd drunk at dinner. 15 males, stationed at our northern boundary, months away from any female company. They've been loyal soldiers. They deserve a reward. No. The word had screamed through Elena's mind, but her voice had frozen in her throat. You'll serve them, Vance had continued, as casually as if he were assigning kitchen duties. A comfort servant. Your body may be useless for heirs, but I'm sure the patrol will find other uses for it. Alpha, please. The words had finally torn free, desperate and raw. His hand had cracked across her face so fast she hadn't seen it coming. Elena had hit the stone floor hard, tasting blood, the world spinning around her. Did I ask you to speak? Vance had crouched beside her, gripping her chin, forcing her to meet his cold gray eyes. You're nothing, Elena. Less than nothing. A cursed female with a dead womb. Be grateful I'm giving you a purpose at all. He'd risen, adjusting the fur cloak at his shoulders. She goes to the patrol at dawn. Keep her in the cellar until then. And Marta. A pause. Make sure she's prepared. The males prefer their servants docile. Elena had understood what that meant. The herbs. The ones that made females compliant, clouded their minds, stole their will to fight. She'd been dragged to the cellar by 2 of Vance's guards, thrown onto the cold stone floor like refuse. They'd laughed as they locked the iron gate, trading crude jokes about what the patrol would do with her, how long she'd last before they broke her completely. Pretty little thing won't be so pretty after a month with Garrett's squad, one had said. Maybe they'll share. The other had grinned, yellow teeth flashing in the torchlight. All 15 at once. Think she can handle that? Their laughter had faded as they'd climbed the stairs, leaving Elena alone in the darkness. And that's when she'd seen it. The crack in the foundation stones. A gap barely wide enough for a small woman to squeeze through, leading to an old drainage tunnel. Elena hadn't thought. She'd just moved. The tunnel had been half flooded with icy runoff from the mountain streams. She'd waded through water up to her chest, feeling something strange snap inside her as she crossed the underground river. Her connection to Thornwood, already tenuous, had severed completely. She'd felt it break like a thread being cut, and for one terrifying moment she'd been utterly alone in her own mind. Now, what felt like hours later, though it might have been less, time stretching and warping in the frozen dark. Miles from Thornwood territory, the adrenaline that had carried her this far was fading. Something warm still flickered in her chest, a faint ember that seemed to push back against the killing cold. She didn't understand it, didn't question it. She just kept moving. The cold was winning. She was losing feeling in her hands, her arms, her legs becoming clumsy and slow. The shift was soaked through with melted snow, clinging to her body like a frozen second skin. I'm going to die out here. The thought came with strange clarity. No panic, just acknowledgement. At least I'll die free. At least they won't. She couldn't finish the thought. The images were too horrible, too vivid. 15 males. Using her. Breaking her. Night after night until there was nothing left of who she'd been. No. She forced her legs to keep moving. I didn't survive 22 years of being treated like garbage to die in a snowdrift. I didn't... The ground gave way beneath her. Elena cried out as she tumbled down a steep embankment, branches and rocks tearing at her skin, snow filling her mouth and nose. She hit the bottom hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. For a long moment, she just lay there, gasping, staring up at the cold stars visible through the gaps in the forest canopy. Get up. She couldn't. Get up. Her body refused to obey. The cold had sunk too deep, turning her muscles to stone, her blood to ice. She could feel consciousness beginning to slip away, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. This is Shadowfang territory. The realization came dimly from somewhere far away. She'd crossed the border without knowing it. She was going to die on enemy land, and no one would ever know what had happened to her. Maybe that's better, she thought hazily. Maybe it's better to just disappear. The last thing Elena saw before the darkness claimed her was a shape moving through the trees, massive, hulking, eyes gleaming gold in the starlight. Wolf, her fading mind supplied. A very large wolf. Then there was nothing at all. The patrol had been Kane's idea of torture. 12 years since the fire. 12 years since he'd watched his pack burn while Alistair Wildfire's wolves held him down, forcing him to witness every death, every scream. His mother, his father, his baby sister, only 7 years old, her small body engulfed in flames because she'd tried to run to him. Kane didn't sleep much anymore. The nightmares came whenever he closed his eyes, screaming, smoke, the smell of burning flesh. So instead of sleeping, he walked his territory. Sometimes in human form, sometimes as the massive black wolf that had earned him fearful whispers across the realm. The Shadow King, they called him. The Broken Alpha. He wasn't broken. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment Alistair Wildfire let his guard down, waiting for the chance to tear out the throat of the male who destroyed everything Kane loved. Waiting for... The scent hit him like a physical blow. Kane stopped mid-stride, his wolf surging forward with an intensity that made his bones ache. His head snapped toward the eastern boundary, nostrils flaring, every muscle in his massive body going rigid. Female. Fear. Blood. And underneath all of that, something else. Something that made his heart stutter in his chest, and his claws extend without his permission. Moonlight and midnight flowers. He was running before his conscious mind caught up with his body, his powerful legs eating up the frozen ground, snow spraying behind him. The scent grew stronger with every stride, pulling him forward like an invisible rope tied around his chest. Mine, his wolf growled. Mine. Kane didn't understand. He hadn't felt his wolf this strongly in years, hadn't felt anything but cold, methodical rage since the fire. But something about this scent was cracking open places inside him he'd thought long dead, flooding him with urgency and desperate need. He found her at the bottom of the ravine. Kane skidded to a halt, shifting between one heartbeat and the next, trading his wolf form for the scarred, battle-hardened body of a man. He barely felt the cold against his bare skin as he dropped to his knees beside the crumpled figure in the snow. Female. Young. Wearing nothing but a thin shift that might as well have been cobwebs for all the protection it provided. Her skin was pale, too pale, tinged blue at the lips, at the fingertips. Scratches and cuts marked her arms and legs, small spots of frozen blood on the white fabric. But it was her face that made Kane's breath catch. Even unconscious, even half-dead from exposure, she was beautiful. Not the cold, calculated beauty of the high-born females who'd been paraded before him since he'd claimed the Shadowfang throne, but something rawer, more real. Dark hair spilled across the snow like ink, and her features were delicate without being fragile. Strong cheekbones, a determined jaw, lips that would probably curve into stubbornness when she was awake. A silver birthmark traced along her collarbone, an unusual crescent shape that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the starlight. Kane had never seen anything like it. Kane pressed 2 fingers to her throat and found a pulse. Weak. Thready. But there. Who is she? His wolf didn't care about answers. His wolf only knew one thing. Ours. Save her. Protect her. Ours. Kane gathered her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she were made of glass. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel her ribs through the thin shift, feel how small and fragile she was against the bulk of his body. A surge of protective rage flooded through him, hot and ferocious. Who had done this? Who had sent this female out into a winter storm wearing nothing? Who had hurt her badly enough to make her run? Kane would find them. and he would make them bleed. But first, he had to get her warm. He ran. The stronghold wasn't far, and Cain pushed his body to its limits, using every ounce of his alpha speed to close the distance. The female didn't stir in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, her frozen fingers limp against his chest. Each second that passed felt like an hour, each beat of her struggling heart a countdown towards something Cain refused to accept. She's not going to die, he told himself, told his wolf, who was howling with fear inside his skull. I didn't find her just to lose her. He didn't examine why the thought of losing a female he'd never met made his chest ache like a fresh wound. He didn't have time. Open the gates! His roar split the pre-dawn quiet, and the wolves on watch scrambled to obey. Cain burst through the entrance to his stronghold, modest, rebuilt from the ashes of what Alistair had burned, but his, and headed straight for his personal chambers. Alpha? His second-in-command, Marcus, fell into step beside him, eyes widening at the limp figure in Cain's arms. What? Who is? Healer. Now. Marcus didn't argue. He knew better than to question Cain when he used that tone. Cain shouldered through the door to his chambers and laid the female on his bed, pulling the thick furs up over her frozen body. His hands were shaking, and he clenched them into fists to make them stop. Hold on, he thought at her, though she couldn't hear him. Just hold on. The healer arrived minutes later. Old Petra, who'd served his father before the fire, one of the few survivors who'd found their way back to Cain when he'd started rebuilding. She took one look at the female in the bed and went to work, barking orders for hot water, more blankets, warming stones. Cain stood in the corner and watched, his heart in his throat, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin. He should leave. He had duties, responsibilities, a pack to run. There was no reason for him to hover over an unconscious stranger like a worried mate. Mate. The word slid through his mind, and Cain went very, very still. No, he told himself firmly. That's impossible. He'd stopped believing in fated mates years ago. When the fire had taken everything, when the goddess had stood by and let his family burn, Cain had decided that fate was a lie, a story they told pups to give them hope. But his wolf? His wolf didn't lie. And his wolf was screaming one word over and over with a certainty that shook Cain to his core. Mate, mate, mate. She'll live, Petra announced, breaking through Cain's spiraling thoughts. The old healer straightened from the bed, wiping her hands on a cloth. It was close. Another hour in that cold and she'd be gone. But she's strong this one. She's fighting. Cain's knees nearly buckled with relief. What pack? Petra shook her head. Can't tell. She's got no scent markers, no pack bond I can detect. It's like... She frowned. Like she's been severed. Cast out. The old healer paused, her wrinkled brow furrowing deeper. Although, there's something strange. Her blood carries traces of running water. She must have fled through a river or underground stream. That would break most pack bonds. But there's something else masking her scent. Something I can't identify. Almost like her own magic is hiding her. Cast out. Left to die. Abandoned. And somehow protected by something even Petra couldn't name. The protective rage returned, hotter than before. Someone had done this to her. Someone had thrown her away like garbage, and Cain was going to find out who. But that would wait. For now. Leave us, he said quietly. Petra raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She gathered her supplies and slipped out, closing the door behind her. Cain stood alone in the chamber with the unconscious female, his mate, if his wolf was to be believed, and tried to understand how his entire world had shifted in the space of a single night. He pulled a chair beside the bed and settled into it, his amber gaze fixed on her pale face. Wake up, he thought. Wake up and tell me your name. Wake up and let me find out if this impossible thing is real. Elena's first conscious thought was warmth. After hours, days, of bone-deep cold, The sensation was so foreign that her mind couldn't quite process it. She was wrapped in something soft, something that smelled like pine and wood smoke, and something else, something darker and richer that made her want to burrow deeper into the furs and never emerge. Her second thought was that she wasn't dead. This surprised her more than the warmth. She'd been so certain, lying in that snow-filled ravine with the cold stealing her breath and the darkness closing in, that she'd finally reached the end. No more running. No more fear. No more being treated like she was less than the dirt beneath their boots. But her heart was beating. Her lungs were drawing breath, and somewhere nearby she could hear the crackling of a fire. Elena opened her eyes. The room swam into focus slowly. Stone walls, rough-hewn wooden beams, tapestries that had seen better days but still held their colors. A fire blazed in a massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across surfaces worn smooth by years of use. It wasn't the grand chamber of an alpha's hall, but it wasn't a prison cell either. Where am I? She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, her head spinning with the sudden movement. She must have made some sound, a gasp, a whimper, because suddenly there was movement in the corner of her vision. And then, she saw him. He rose from a chair beside the bed, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. He was massive, easily the largest male she'd ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to block out the firelight and arms thick with corded muscle. Scars traced patterns across his bare chest, pale lines against tanned skin that spoke of battles survived and enemies defeated. His hair was dark, almost black, falling in disheveled waves around a face that might have been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. They burned amber gold, wolf-bright and molten, like coins heated in a forge. They were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Run," some instinct whispered. "Danger, predator, run." But she couldn't move, couldn't look away. And then his eyes met hers fully and the world shifted. Heat exploded through Elena's chest like someone had poured molten silver directly into her heart. It spread outward in waves, racing through her veins, flooding her limbs with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the furs. Her skin felt like it was glowing from within, every nerve ending suddenly alive and reaching toward the male in front of her. Deep inside her mind, something stirred. Something that had been silent her entire life. So quiet she'd almost forgotten it existed. Her wolf. The inner beast that every shifter carried but that Elena had never truly felt, suddenly howled. The sound echoed through her consciousness, wild and joyous and desperate, a sound of recognition that shattered every belief she'd held about herself. "Mate," her wolf sang. "Mate." Elena watched the male's reaction as if seeing it from outside her own body. His whole frame went rigid, muscles locking with such sudden tension that she could see them cord beneath his scarred skin. His pupils dilated, the gold of his irises seeming to glow brighter, and his nostrils flared as he drew in a sharp breath. A sound rumbled up from his chest, a growl deep and primal that vibrated through the air between them and seemed to resonate in Elena's very bones. Not a threatening sound, but something else. Something that made her heart race and her body flush with heat. "Mate," he breathed, and the word was rough, torn from him like it had been ripped from somewhere deep inside. His voice was low, rough, like gravel wrapped in velvet, and it did things to Elena that she couldn't begin to understand. She couldn't speak, could barely think. Her mind was a chaos of impossible sensations and even more impossible conclusions. This couldn't be real. The mate bond was supposed to be a myth, a story told to pups to give them hope, and even if it wasn't, even if it was real, it couldn't be her. Not cursed, broken, worthless Elena Nightshade. Your womb is cursed. Marta's voice echoed in her memory. She will never carry viable young. The heat in her chest flickered, threatened by the cold weight of those words. Why would the goddess give her a fated mate when she couldn't even fulfill the most basic purpose of an omega? What cruel joke was this? But her wolf didn't care about logic or cruel jokes. Her wolf only knew what it felt, and what it felt was rightness. A bone-deep certainty that this scarred, massive male was hers, that she belonged to him, that every step she'd taken through that frozen forest had been leading her here, to this moment, to those golden eyes. "You're awake." His voice was steadier now, though she could see the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides, as if he was fighting to keep himself from reaching for her. "How do you feel?" "Like my entire world just turned inside out." Elena's voice came out as a croak, her throat raw from cold and disuse. She tried again. "Where am I?" "Shadowfang territory, my stronghold." He took a step closer, then stopped himself, that barely restrained energy radiating from him in waves. "My patrol found you in the snow. You nearly died." Shadowfang. The word penetrated the haze in her mind, and a new kind of fear trickled through her veins. She'd heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. The Shadow King, the broken alpha, the male who let his pack burn. But the stories hadn't mentioned anything about golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. They hadn't mentioned the way his presence filled the room without suffocating it, or the way his scarred hands hung at his sides as if he was afraid of frightening her. "You're him," she whispered. "The Alpha King." Something flickered in his golden gaze. Pain, maybe, or resignation. "Cain," he said simply. "My name is Cain." The name settled into her consciousness like a stone dropping into still water. Cain. Her wolf whispered it like a prayer, rolling the single syllable through her mind as if tasting it. "Elena," she heard herself say, though she hadn't meant to. "My name is Elena." His eyes closed briefly, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed. When he opened them again, they burned brighter than before. "Elena." He said her name like it was something precious, something fragile that he needed to handle with care. "The healer says you'll recover fully. You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." Safe. The word was so foreign that Elena almost laughed. When had she ever been safe? Even in her own pack, surrounded by wolves who were supposed to be her family, she'd never once felt truly protected. But looking into Cain's burning amber eyes, feeling the impossible warmth of the bond thrumming between them, Elena felt something dangerous and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. She felt the first fragile stirrings of hope. The recognition had happened. Now came the harder part, the part where they both had to figure out what it meant. Cain didn't leave. He stayed in that chair beside her bed, close enough that Elena could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body, but far enough that he wasn't crowding her. Every instinct she'd developed over 22 years of surviving in a hostile pack told her to be wary, to keep her guard up, to remember that males always wanted something, but Cain just sat there, watching her with those golden eyes, waiting. "You should rest," he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that Elena's racing thoughts had begun to quiet. "The healer will check on you in the morning. Are you hungry? Thirsty? I can have food brought." The questions were so unexpectedly gentle that Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, horrified by her own weakness. "I'm fine," she managed. "You're not fine." His voice was quiet but certain. "You nearly died. You're half-starved, covered in cuts, and wearing clothes that wouldn't keep a mouse warm. But if you don't want to tell me what happened, I won't force you." Won't force you. In Elena's experience, alphas didn't ask. They took. They demanded. They expected obedience and punished defiance with swift, brutal efficiency. Alpha Vance had never once in her life given her a choice about anything. But this alpha, this scarred, massive, golden-eyed alpha who was supposedly broken and savage, was sitting beside her bed and telling her he wouldn't force her to talk. Why? The word slipped out before she could stop it. "Why are you being like this?" Cain's expression shifted, something dark and dangerous flickering in his eyes. "Like what?" Kind. Elena couldn't quite keep the suspicion out of her voice. I'm a strange Omega who collapsed on your territory. I'm cursed, worthless, damaged goods. She couldn't bring herself to say the words aloud. You don't owe me anything. For a long moment, Kane just looked at her. Then he leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees, and Elena had to fight the urge to shrink back from his intensity. I know what it's like, he said slowly, to be treated as less than, to have people look at you and see only what you lack, only what you've lost. I know what it's like to have the world decide you're broken before you've even had a chance to prove them wrong. His amber eyes held hers, and Elena saw her own pain reflected back at her. Not the same pain, but a kinship in suffering that made her chest ache. I don't know what happened to you, Kane continued. I don't know who hurt you, or why you were running through a blizzard in nothing but a shift, but I know that whatever you've been told about yourself, whatever they made you believe. He shook his head. You're worth more than that. You are more than that. Elena's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything but a disappointing Omega with a cursed womb. You don't know me, she whispered. No, he agreed. But I'd like to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Elena wasn't ready to examine. The mate bond pulsed in her chest, warm and insistent, urging her to lean into his warmth, to let herself believe. But belief was dangerous. Trust was dangerous. And Elena had learned those lessons in blood and bruises over 22 years. She looked away from that burning gaze, focusing instead on her hands, still bearing the scratches from her flight through the forest. I'm tired, she said, though it came out sounding more like a plea than a statement. Kane rose immediately, backing away from the bed with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. Of course. I'll leave you to rest. He was already at the door when Elena's voice stopped him. Where will you sleep? Kane turned and she caught the ghost of something. Was that a smile? At the corner of his scarred mouth. Outside your door, he said simply. No one will disturb you. And then he was gone, leaving Elena alone with the fire and the furs and the impossible warmth still thrumming through her veins. Outside my door. She thought of Alpha Vance, who would never have given up his chambers for anyone, let alone a worthless Omega. She thought of the males in her pack, who would have taken what they wanted without asking, without caring if she agreed. And she thought of Kane, the supposedly savage Alpha King, sleeping in the hallway like a guard dog so that she could feel safe. Elena's wolf hummed with contentment, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep without being afraid. She woke to the sound of voices outside her door. Not loud. Whoever was speaking was trying to keep quiet, but the words carried through the thick wood nonetheless, sharp with tension. Don't understand, Alpha. She's a stranger. An Omega from who knows what pack, with no explanation for how she ended up half dead on our border. And you're just going to give her your chambers? Let her sleep in your bed? The voice was male, sneering in a way that made Elena's stomach clench with familiar dread. She'd heard that tone before, countless times. It was the voice of someone who saw her as less than nothing. Careful, Marcus. Kane's voice was a low rumble, dangerous in its quiet. Be very careful what you say next. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. The other male, Marcus, didn't seem to recognize the warning in his Alpha's tone. We don't know anything about her. For all we know, she's a spy. Alistair could have sent her. At the name, Elena felt Kane's energy shift even through the closed door. Something dark and deadly entered the air, a pressure that made her wolf whimper. She's not a spy. Kane's words were clipped, barely controlled. And how do you know that? Because she's pretty? Because she looked pathetic lying in the snow? Marcus laughed, and the sound was ugly. The males are already talking. They're saying she must be defective in some way. No pack throws out a healthy female, so what's wrong with her? Is her womb? Elena heard the impact, before she registered what had happened. A crash. A gasp. And then Kane's voice, so cold and furious that it made her blood freeze in her veins. You will never speak of her that way again. Elena threw back the furs and stumbled to the door, her body protesting the sudden movement. She yanked it open and found exactly what she'd expected. Marcus pinned against the stone wall, Kane's massive hand wrapped around his throat, the alpha's eyes blazing with barely leashed rage. Other wolves had gathered in the hallway, watching with expressions ranging from shock to fear. None of them moved to intervene. None of them dared. She is your future Luna. Kane's words came out as a growl, each one dripping with menace. The next wolf who speaks against my mate loses their tongue. Do you understand me, Marcus? Marcus's face was turning red, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Kane's grip. He managed a choked nod, eyes bulging with terror. Speak the words, Kane demanded. I understand. Alpha. Her name is Elena. Say it. Lady. Elena. Elena moved without thinking. She crossed the distance between them and laid her hand on Kane's arm, the arm holding his beta against the wall like a rag doll. The effect was immediate. Kane's entire body went still at her touch, the rage in his eyes flickering, softening as he turned to look at her. He didn't mean it, Elena said softly. Let him go, please. She didn't know why she was pleading for mercy for a male who'd just been mocking her. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the knowledge that violence always bred more violence, that blood demanded blood, that if Marcus was punished too harshly, there would be others who blamed her for it. Or maybe it was the look in Kane's eyes, the raw, desperate need to protect her that had turned him into something terrifying, something that could lose control if he wasn't careful. Elena kept her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, the barely contained power thrumming beneath his scarred skin. Please, she said again. Kane held her gaze for a long moment, something passing between them that made her breath catch. The mate bond sang in her chest, warm and sweet and overwhelming. Then his fingers unclenched. Marcus dropped to the ground, gasping and choking, scrambling away from his alpha like Kane was a live flame that had just burned him. Elena watched him go, watched the other wolves part to let him through, and felt a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Everyone out. Kane's voice was still rough, but the deadly edge had faded. Now. They scattered like leaves before a wind, leaving Elena and Kane alone in the hallway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Kane was staring at her with something like wonder on his scarred face, his amber eyes searching hers as if looking for answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. You didn't have to do that, Elena said finally. Yes. His voice was certain, absolute. I did. He's your second in command, your beta. You could have made an enemy. Kane made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so rough. Marcus is many things, but he's not a fool. He'll come around when he realizes what you are. What I am. The words hung in the air between them, and Elena felt her heart begin to race. And what am I? She asked, barely above a whisper. Kane stepped closer, and Elena had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. This close, she could see the individual scars that marked his face, could smell that intoxicating scent of pine and wood smoke, and something purely him. You're my mate, he said simply. My Luna, my future queen. His voice dropped even lower, becoming something intimate and private, meant only for her. You're everything, Elena. Everything I stopped believing in. Elena's wolf howled with joy, but her human heart was still afraid, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to turn to cruelty, for the dream to become a nightmare. You don't know what I am, she heard herself say. You don't know what they said about me, what the healer found. I don't care. Kane's hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. Whatever they told you, whatever they did to make you run, it doesn't matter. Not to me. Not to my wolf. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Elena felt something crack inside her chest. Some wall she'd built so long ago she'd forgotten it existed. "I'm scared," she admitted, and the words cost her more than she could say. "I know." Kane's wolf-bright eyes were soft, softer than she ever would have expected from the savage alpha king of the stories. "You don't have to trust me yet. You don't have to believe me. Just—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Just let me show you. Let me prove that not all alphas are like whoever hurt you." "Why?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. "Why does it matter so much?" Kane's smile was small, barely there, but it transformed his scarred face into something almost beautiful. "Because you're my mate," he said simply. "And that means your pain is my pain. Your fear is my fear. Your enemies are my enemies." His hand slid from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, a possessive gesture that should have terrified her, but instead made her feel anchored, safe. "I would burn the world for you, Elena, and I don't even know you yet." Elena stared up at him, this massive, scarred alpha who'd been branded broken by a world that didn't understand him. She thought of everything she'd been told about herself. Cursed, worthless, useless for anything but warming the beds of males who would never see her as more than a tool. And then she thought of Kane's burning gaze, and the way he looked at her like she was precious, like she mattered. "Maybe," a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, "maybe I've been wrong about everything." Elena didn't know if she believed it. Didn't know if she could trust this impossible bond, this impossible male, this impossible hope blooming in her chest. But for the first time in 22 years, she wanted to try. "Okay," she said softly. "Show me." And when Kane's smile widened, something warm and genuine breaking through the granite of his features, Elena felt her wolf settle into a peace she'd never known before. It was only the beginning. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Elena hadn't expected. She woke each morning in Kane's chambers. He still slept in the hall outside her door, despite her increasingly awkward protests, and found fresh clothes laid out for her, simple but well-made garments in deep forest greens and soft grays that fit her far better than anything she'd owned in Thornwood. Breakfast appeared on a small table by the fire, warm porridge with honey and dried berries, a luxury she'd never been afforded in her old pack. And always, there was the awareness of Kane somewhere nearby, his presence a steady pulse at the edge of her consciousness that her wolf tracked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Elena finally worked up the courage to explore beyond the Alpha's quarters. The Shadowfang stronghold was nothing like the grand pack house she'd glimpsed once when Alpha Vance had hosted a gathering of neighboring packs. That structure had been all gleaming wood and polished stone, a monument to wealth and power. Kane's fortress was rougher, newer, with walls that still smelled of fresh-cut timber and floors that creaked beneath her feet. But there was a warmth to it, a sense of purpose and determination in every carefully placed stone and hand-hewn beam. She wandered through corridors that opened into common areas where pack members gathered to share meals and conversation. They fell silent when she appeared, their eyes tracking her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that made her wolf bristle with unease. She was an outsider here, a stranger who'd appeared from enemy territory, and somehow captured their alpha's attention. She understood their suspicion. She'd have felt the same. It was during one of these explorations that she stumbled upon the training grounds, a wide courtyard at the heart of the stronghold, where Kane's warriors gathered to hone their skills. Elena pressed herself against the doorway, watching as wolves in human form circled each other with predatory grace, their movements fluid and deadly. She spotted Kane immediately, his massive frame impossible to miss among the other males. He'd stripped to the waist despite the cold, his scarred torso gleaming with sweat as he demonstrated a defensive technique to a group of younger wolves. But this wasn't the Kane who spoke softly to her through closed doors, who asked permission before entering his own chambers. This cane was carved from ice. A young warrior stumbled during a drill, and Kane's voice cracked across the courtyard like a whip. Again, and if you fall like that in battle, you die. Your packmates die. Is that what you want? The young wolf scrambled to his feet, terror in his eyes. No, Alpha. Then stop wasting my time. Kane turned away, dismissing the trembling warrior without another glance. His face was a mask of cold indifference, the same expression Elena had seen on Alpha Vance, though Kane's held no cruelty, only a vast frozen distance. This was the Shadow King the stories spoke of. This was the male who had survived the massacre by locking away everything soft about himself. Elena's mouth went dry. She'd known he was large, had felt the power of him when he'd carried her through the snow, but seeing him like this, muscles rippling beneath battle-marked skin, the sheer brutal efficiency of his movements, it awakened something in her that she didn't know how to name. Her wolf pressed forward, practically panting with appreciation, and Elena had to grip the doorframe to keep herself from swaying toward him like some moonstruck pup. As if sensing her gaze, Kane's head turned. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and Elena felt that familiar heat bloom in her chest, spreading through her veins like liquid fire. His wolf-bright gaze softened when it found her, and Kane's lips curved into a small smile, and he said something to the wolves around him before crossing the courtyard toward her with long, unhurried strides. "You're awake," he said, and there was something pleased in his voice, something warm that made her wolf practically purr. "How are you feeling?" "Better." Elena forced herself to meet his eyes, though it took more courage than she cared to admit. "Your pack's hospitality has been generous." Kane's smile flickered. "Has it? No one's given you trouble?" She thought of the whispers that followed her, the sidelong glances, the way conversations died when she entered a room. "Nothing I can't handle." Something shifted in Kane's eyes, something dangerous. "Elena, tell me the truth." It wasn't a command, not quite, but Elena felt the weight of his alpha authority pressing against her, not demanding obedience but requesting honesty. Her wolf wanted to roll over and bare her throat to submit to this male who is everything an alpha should be. "They're cautious," she admitted, "which is understandable. I'm a stranger from a hostile pack who showed up half dead and somehow ended up in your chambers. They don't trust me." "They don't know you yet," Kane corrected. "But they will." He reached out, and Elena held her breath as his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face, the touch feather-light and achingly gentle. "And when they do, they'll love you as I—" He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. "As the pack should love their Luna." Elena's heart stuttered. "As I— what?" She wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come, trapped behind the wall of fear she couldn't quite bring herself to tear down. Before she could find her voice, a commotion at the gates drew Kane's attention. His body went rigid, every muscle tensing with predatory alertness, and Elena felt a growl building in his chest before she heard it. "What is it?" she asked, but Kane was already moving, barking orders to his warriors as he strode toward the source of the disturbance. Elena followed, her wolf urging her to stay close to her mate, and found herself in the main courtyard just as the gates swung open. A lone figure stumbled through. A young male, barely more than a boy, his clothes torn and his face streaked with blood and dirt. He collapsed to his knees before Kane, gasping for breath. "Alpha King!" the boy wheezed. "Message. From Alistair Wildfire." The name meant nothing to Elena, but she saw the effect it had on the wolves around her. Warriors exchanged grim looks, hands moving to weapons. A female nearby let out a soft whimper of fear, and Kane went utterly still, his face becoming a mask of stone that revealed nothing of the fury Elena could feel, pulsing through the bond between them. "Speak," Kane commanded, his voice flat and cold. The messenger boy reached into his torn shirt and produced a folded piece of paper, stained with what looked horribly like blood. He said you'd understand." Kane snatched the paper from the boy's trembling hand and unfolded it. Elena watched his eyes move across the words. Saw his jaw clench so hard she could hear his teeth grinding. When he finished, his fist closed around the paper, crushing it into a crumpled ball. Marcus, Kane said, his voice deceptively calm. But Elena saw the ice in his eyes, the same cold mask she'd witnessed in the training yard. This was the Alpha who'd rebuilt from ashes, who'd survived by becoming something harder than the world that had tried to break him. Take the boy to the healers, see that he's fed and given a place to rest, then double the perimeter watch and have the scouts report every hour. Anyone who fails their post answers to me personally. The last words carried a weight that made several wolves flinch. Elena understood now why they called him the Shadow King. The beta stepped forward. His eyes flicked to Elena briefly, not with hostility, but with something more complicated. The bruises on his throat from Kane's grip had faded, but the memory clearly hadn't. Still, duty came first. Alpha, what does it say? Kane didn't answer. His eyes found Elena's, and she saw something in them that made her blood run cold, a mixture of rage and fear, and terrible, terrible resignation. Everyone out, Kane said quietly. Elena, stay. The courtyard emptied with remarkable speed, wolves melting away through doorways and gates until only Elena and Kane remained. He stared at the crumpled paper in his fist for a long moment, then slowly uncurled his fingers and smoothed it out. 10 years ago, he said, his voice rough, my pack was one of the largest in the Northern Territories. My father was Alpha, and I was his heir. We had lands, wealth, power. He paused, and Elena saw his throat work as he swallowed. We had a treaty with the Wildfire Pack, an alliance that had held for 3 generations. Elena moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. What happened? Alistair happened. Kane's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. He was Alpha Wildfire's second son, ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for more than his bloodline offered. When his father refused to expand into neutral territories, Alistair challenged him. 1. Another pause, heavier this time. And then he decided that our alliance was no longer convenient. He attacked you? He slaughtered us. The words came out flat, empty of emotion in a way that was somehow worse than rage. Came at dawn, when most of the pack was still sleeping. Set fire to the pack house and picked off anyone who tried to flee. My father, my mother, my younger sister. Kane's eyes closed, and Elena watched a muscle jump in his jaw. I was 17. I survived only because I was away, dealing with a dispute at our eastern border. By the time I returned, he shook his head. There was nothing left to return to. Elena's chest ached with a pain that wasn't entirely her own. She could feel Kane's grief through the bond, a wound that had never truly healed, only scabbed over with years of survival and vengeance and cold, hard determination. The message, she said softly. What does it say? Kane opened his eyes and looked at her, and Elena felt her heart break at the guilt she saw there. Alistair has discovered that I found my mate, he said. He's demanding that I surrender you to him, or he'll burn what I've rebuilt and finish what he started 10 years ago. The world seemed to tilt beneath Elena's feet. Why? She whispered. Why would he want me? Kane's expression shifted, something dark and complicated moving behind those wolf-bright eyes. I don't know, he admitted. Alistair has spies everywhere. He's probably had someone watching Shadowfang since before you arrived. But that doesn't explain how he knows who you are. He paused, jaw tightening. Unless the message mentions your bloodline, the Nightshade line. He seems to know more about your heritage than you do. Elena's blood ran cold. Her grandmother's name. The stories about ancient power sleeping in their blood. How could he possibly? Alistair is old, Kane said grimly. Older than he looks. He spent decades collecting secrets, hoarding knowledge about the old bloodlines. He paused, jaw tightening. But the nightshade line was supposed to be extinct. Your family must have been hiding. Someone was masking your scent, your bloodline markers. When you crossed that underground river, when your pack bond severed. His eyes met hers with grim understanding. Whatever was hiding you broke too. Your true scent would have flooded out for anyone tracking old bloodlines to sense. If Alistair has been searching for First Wolf descendants for decades, he would have felt it like a beacon. Elena thought of her grandmother's dying words about hiding them, about magic so old even she barely remembered. The old woman's protection had followed Elena even after death, until the moment she'd fled through that underground stream. If he wants you specifically, it's not just to hurt me. There's something else. Something about you that he knows and we don't. Elena thought of the healer in Thornwood, of the tests and the pronouncements, and the word cursed branded onto her soul. She thought of her wolf, silent her entire life until the moment she'd looked into Kane's eyes. She thought of the strange heat that pulsed in her chest, the sensation of power coiled deep inside her that she'd never understood and never questioned, because questioning meant hoping, and hope was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. "I don't know what I am," she said, and the words came out smaller than she intended. "I'm nobody. A cursed female from a nothing pack. I don't have anything he could want." Kane stepped closer, and his hand came up to cup her face with that devastating gentleness she still couldn't quite believe was real. "You're my mate," he said firmly, "and that makes you the most important person in this territory. Whatever Alistair wants, whatever he thinks he knows, we'll face it together." Elena wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly that her whole body ached with the wanting. But the cold logic of survival whispered that she was a liability, a weakness, a target painted on Kane's back. If Alistair wanted her, maybe the best thing she could do was run. Lead the threat away from this pack that had shown her more kindness in 3 days than she'd received in 22 years. But her wolf snarled at the very thought of leaving their mate, and Elena found that she couldn't make herself pull away from Kane's touch. Couldn't make herself walk away from the first person who'd ever looked at her like she mattered. "How long do we have?" she asked instead. Kane's jaw tightened. "The message gives us 3 weeks to decide. He's giving me time to see reason, as he puts it. Time to realize I can't win." 3 weeks. Added to the time she'd already spent here, that would make nearly 2 months total before the deadline arrived. She didn't finish the thought. Didn't have to. It was still a war they couldn't win, against an enemy who'd already destroyed everything Kane loved once before. Elena should have been terrified, and she was. The fear was a living thing inside her, clawing at her chest and stealing her breath. But beneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like anger. She'd spent her whole life being told she was worthless, being treated like a burden, being pushed and pulled and discarded at the whims of those stronger than her. And now this alpha she'd never met, this monster who'd murdered an entire pack for the crime of existing. He thought he could use her as a weapon against the one person who'd ever seen her as more than broken. No, she thought, and the word resonated through her bones with a certainty she'd never felt before. No more. She didn't know what she was. Didn't know why Alistair wanted her or what power might be sleeping inside her. But she was done running, done hiding, done letting others decide her fate. "Show me," she said, and Kane's brow furrowed in confusion. "Show you what?" Elena squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze with a determination that surprised them both. "How to fight, how to defend myself, how to be the Luna your pack needs." She reached up and covered his hand with her own, feeling the warmth of him seep into her cold fingers. "If Alistair wants a war, let's make sure I'm ready for it." Kane stared at her for a long moment, those molten eyes shifting with his expression, surprise bleeding into respect, bleeding into something warmer, something that made Elena's wolf keen with desperate longing. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "Do you know that?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm tired of being afraid." Kane's smile was small but genuine, and it transformed his scarred face into something almost beautiful. Then we train. Tuo, he said, starting now. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and exhilaration. Kane trained her personally, showing her the basic stances and movements of close combat, teaching her how to use her smaller size as an advantage rather than a weakness. She was terrible at first, clumsy and slow, her muscles screaming in protest at every unfamiliar motion. But Kane was patient. Endlessly patient, correcting her form with gentle touches and words of encouragement that made her wolf preen with pleasure. And slowly, something began to change. Elena noticed it first in the way the pack looked at her. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they shifted in tone, becoming less suspicious and more curious. She caught wolves watching her train with something that might have been approval in their eyes. A female named Sarah brought her water during a break, and actually smiled at her. Small and tentative, but real. "You're doing well," Sarah said quietly. "Better than most wolves who've never trained before." Elena wiped sweat from her brow, her muscles aching in ways she'd never experienced. "I feel like I'm dying." Sarah laughed, a surprised sound that seemed to startle even her. "That's how you know it's working." She glanced at Kane, who was demonstrating a technique to a group of younger warriors across the training ground. "He's different with you. Softer. More human." Elena thought of the cold alpha she'd witnessed in the training yard, the one who'd reduced a young warrior to trembling with a few icy words. "I've seen how he is with others. It's different." "Different doesn't cover it." Sarah's voice dropped, becoming almost conspiratorial. "Since the massacre, he's been distant, cold. Like he locked everything human about himself away so he couldn't be hurt again." She looked at Elena with something like wonder. "But with you, it's like watching ice melt. Like he's remembering how to feel." Elena didn't know how to respond to that. The idea that she, broken, cursed Elena, could have that kind of effect on anyone seemed impossible. But she thought of Kane's gentle touches, his soft words, the way he looked at her like she was something precious, and she wondered if maybe Sarah was right. On the evening before Alistair's deadline, Kane found her in the library. It was a small room, barely more than a closet, with shelves lined with books that had been salvaged from the ruins of the old pack or acquired in the years since. Kane's mother had been a scholar of the old ways, he'd told her once. These were the remnants of her collection, the few volumes that hadn't burned. Elena had discovered it that morning and had spent every spare moment since curled up in the worn armchair by the window, reading everything she could find about pack history and wolf lore and the ancient bloodlines that had shaped their world. "You missed dinner," Kane said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his broad chest. Elena looked up from the book in her lap, a crumbling volume about the first wolves, the legendary ancestors who had supposedly given rise to all werewolf kind. "I lost track of time. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize." Kane pushed off the doorframe and crossed to her chair, crouching down so they were at eye level. "What are you reading?" She showed him the cover and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "The First Wolves," he said slowly. "Why?" Elena hesitated, unsure how to explain the strange compulsion that had drawn her to this particular book. "I don't know," she admitted. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about our bloodline carrying something ancient, something sleeping. I thought she was just—" She touched the silver birthmark at her collarbone absently. "But this book mentions the Nightshade line. That was her name before she married. I just felt like I needed to understand." Kane was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes searching her face. Then he reached out and took the book from her hands, setting it aside on the small table nearby. "Elena," he said, and the way he said her name made her wolf shiver with longing. "We need to talk about tomorrow." Her heart clenched. "I know. Alistair won't accept any answer but surrender, and I will not." His voice roughened, breaking slightly before he controlled it. I will not give you to him. Not for anything. Not even to save my pack. Cain. No. His hand came up to cup her face, and Elena leaned into the touch automatically, her body craving the contact in a way that frightened her. Listen to me. I have spent 10 years rebuilding what he destroyed, 10 years of blood and sacrifice and watching wolves I care about die because I wasn't strong enough to protect them. And I would burn it all down again. Every stone, every dream, every hope of the future. Before I let him have you. Tears pricked at Elena's eyes. Why? She whispered. You barely know me. How can I possibly be worth that much? Cain's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Because you're my mate, he said simply. Because from the moment I saw you lying in the snow, my wolf knew what you were. And every moment since has only confirmed it. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to make you understand. But you are everything, Elena. Everything I've been fighting for without knowing what I was fighting for. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She could feel his warmth, could smell his scent. Pine and wood smoke and something purely him, and her wolf was howling, desperate to close the distance between them. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared that you'll realize I'm not worth it, that whatever Alistair knows about me will change how you see me, that I'll wake up tomorrow and this will all have been a dream. Then I'll prove it to you, Cain said. Every day, for as long as we live. I'll prove that you're worth everything. His lips curved into that small, devastating smile. And whatever Alistair thinks he knows about you, we'll face it together, like I said. Elena stared at him, this alpha who'd been branded broken, who'd lost everything and rebuilt from nothing, who looked at her like she was the sun and the moon and every star in the sky. And she felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling, some last defense falling. She moved without conscious thought, closing the distance between them and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, the barest brush of contact, but the bond between them roared to life, heat exploding through Elena's veins like liquid fire. Cain growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through her bones, and his hand slid into her hair, cradling her head as he deepened the kiss. It was everything she'd never dared to want, everything she'd been told she didn't deserve, and it was hers. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Cain rested his forehead against hers. Tomorrow, he said roughly, whatever happens tomorrow, know that you are mine, and I am yours. Nothing, not Alistair, not fate, not the gods themselves, will change that. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words resonating through the bond between them. Yours, she echoed. Mine. Ours. Cain's laugh was soft, almost disbelieving. Ours, he agreed. I never thought I'd have something that was ours. Neither did she. But as she sat in the circle of his arms, his warmth surrounding her and his heartbeat steady against her ear, Elena realized that she had stopped running, stopped hiding, stopped waiting for the cruelty that had defined her life to find her again. Whatever tomorrow brought, war, death, truths she wasn't ready to hear, she would face it. Not alone, not afraid. She would face it with Cain at her side, and her wolf finally awake inside her. And somewhere deep in her chest, coiled beneath layers of fear and doubt, and years of believing she was worthless, something ancient stirred in its sleep, waiting, watching, ready to wake. The attack came at dawn, a full day before Alistair's deadline officially expired, as if he'd never intended to give them a choice at all. Elena woke to screaming, not the sharp cry of a single voice, but the layered cacophony of dozens, wolves and humans and something in between. She was on her feet before she fully understood what was happening, her heart hammering against her ribs as Cain burst through the chamber door. They're here. His voice was steady, but his eyes blazed pure gold, his wolf riding just beneath the surface. Alistair brought 50 wolves. Maybe more. Elena's blood turned to ice. How did they get past the scouts? They came through the river. Ice must have frozen thick enough to hold them. Cain was already strapping on his sword, his movements efficient despite the chaos erupting beyond the walls. I need you to stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Cain. He crossed to her in 3 strides, cupping her face in his hands. The bond between them thrummed with his fear. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. Promise me, whatever happens out there, whatever you hear, you stay hidden. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she couldn't just cower while he fought and bled and possibly died. But she saw the desperation in his eyes, felt it echoing through their connection, and she understood. She was his weakness now. Alistair knew it, and Cain couldn't fight if he was worrying about her. I promise, she whispered. He kissed her, hard, fast, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her, and then he was gone, the door slamming behind him. Elena stood in the sudden silence, her chest heaving. Through the stone walls she could hear the sounds of battle, snarls and screams and the clash of bodies. The acrid scent of blood seeped under the door, and her wolf paced restlessly inside her, desperate to join the fight. She pressed her palms against the cold stone, closing her eyes. Cain was out there somewhere, facing the alpha who had destroyed his entire world. Facing the monster who wanted her for reasons she didn't fully understand. The old Elena would have hidden, would have made herself small and silent and prayed to survive. But she wasn't the old Elena anymore. Something stirred in her chest. That ancient presence she'd felt last night, coiled and waiting. It shifted now, responding to her fear, her fury, her desperate need to protect the mate she'd only just found. A crash echoed from somewhere below. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, climbing the stairs toward her. Elena backed away from the door, her heart pounding. Cain's scent would have marked this room as important. If Alistair's wolves found it. The door exploded inward. 3 wolves poured through, already shifted, their massive forms filling the chamber. Behind them walked a man, tall, golden-haired, with the kind of cruel beauty that made Elena's skin crawl. His eyes swept the room and landed on her with predatory satisfaction. Elena Nightshade, Alistair Wildfire said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. I've been looking for you for a very long time. Elena's wolf snarled inside her, but she couldn't shift, had never been able to shift, her wolf too weak from years of dormancy. She was trapped, defenseless, exactly what she'd always been. No. The thought came from somewhere deep, somewhere ancient. Not anymore. How do you know my name? She demanded, and was proud that her voice didn't shake. Alistair smiled, revealing elongated canines. Because your blood runs in the oldest records. The Nightshade line. The first wolves, they called themselves. Ruled the packs for 1,000 years before they were supposedly wiped out. He stepped closer, and his wolves fanned out to flank her. But they weren't wiped out, were they? One survived. One was hidden away in a nothing pack, told she was cursed, bred like cattle in hopes of producing heirs. They didn't know what they had. Elena's mind raced. Her grandmother's stories. The book about the first wolves. The silver that had flickered in her veins when Cain first touched her. You're wrong, she whispered. Am I? Alistair's eyes gleamed with triumph. Your children would carry that blood, Elena, that power. And I will have that power, one way or another. Cain dies today. And you. He reached out to touch her face. Elena flinched back, and something inside her cracked open. It wasn't like the warmth she felt around Cain. This was different. Older. Wilder. A force that had slept for generations and was now clawing its way to the surface. Silver light exploded from her skin, flooding the chamber with blinding radiance. Alistair's wolves dropped to the floor, whimpering, their massive bodies pressing against the stone in instinctive submission. Even Alistair staggered back, his eyes widening with shock. Impossible, he breathed. You're barely more than a pup. That power shouldn't manifest for decades. But Elena understood now. The bond with Cain had been building for weeks. Every touch, every whispered word, every night she'd felt him sleeping outside her door. The mate recognition had cracked open something ancient inside her, and each day with him had widened that crack further. She wasn't fully mated yet, but she was close enough. The power had been waking in stages, waiting for a moment of desperate need to surge fully to life. Get away from me. Elena's voice came out layered, resonant, like a dozen voices speaking in harmony. She didn't understand what was happening, only that she was no longer afraid. The presence in her chest was fully awake now, ancient and terrible and utterly hers. She didn't wait for Alistair to recover. She ran. The corridors were chaos, blood on the walls, bodies crumpled in corners, the sounds of battle echoing from every direction. An enemy wolf lunged at her from a doorway, teeth bared, and Elena moved without thinking. Dropping low and twisting aside exactly the way Cain had taught her, using her smaller size as an advantage. The wolf's momentum carried it past her, and she drove her elbow into its exposed throat, sending it crashing to the floor. Use their strength against them, Cain's voice echoed in her memory. You'll never overpower them, so don't try. Be faster. Be smarter. She kept running, the silver light flickering around her like armor as she followed the pull of the bond, the thread of warmth that connected her to Cain. She found him in the great hall. Cain was magnificent in his fury, shifted halfway into his wolf form, larger and more powerful than any shifter Elena had ever seen. He'd carved a bloody path through Alistair's forces, bodies littering the floor around him. Fighting back-to-back with him was Marcus, the beta's earlier doubts forgotten in the heat of battle. Blood ran from a gash across Marcus's face, but he fought with the desperate ferocity of a wolf defending his home, and when he spotted Elena in the doorway, he didn't sneer or hesitate. He shouted a warning and redoubled his efforts, buying Cain precious seconds to turn. But they were surrounded now, a dozen wolves closing in, and even their combined strength had limits. And beyond the circle of enemies, Elena saw Alistair appear through a side door, a wicked blade gleaming in his hand, moving toward Cain's exposed back. Time slowed. Elena didn't think, didn't hesitate. She simply moved, her body acting before her mind could catch up, throwing herself between Cain and the descending blade. Elena, no! Cain's roar shattered the air, but Elena was already there, already standing with her arms spread wide as Alistair's strike came down. Silver light erupted from her body in a wave of pure force. The blade shattered. Alistair was thrown backward, crashing into the stone wall hard enough to crack it. And every wolf in the room, every enemy who had come to destroy Shadowfang, dropped to their knees as the power of the first wolves washed over them, ancient and undeniable. Elena stood at the center of it all, silver light streaming from her eyes and her fingertips, her voice ringing through the hall. You will not touch him. You will not harm this pack. I am Elena of the Nightshade bloodline, daughter of the first wolves, and you will submit. The command wasn't just words, it was power, raw and primal, the authority of bloodlines that predated the pack structure itself. Alistair's wolves whimpered, pressing their bellies to the floor, unable to resist. Even Alistair, climbing to his feet against the far wall, looked shaken. You don't know how to control it, he snarled. That power will burn you alive if you keep using it. Maybe. Elena's voice was steady now, though she could feel the truth of his words. The silver light was consuming something inside her, taking as much as it gave. But I'll take you with me. She reached out with her power, wrapping it around Alistair like chains of light, holding him frozen in place. His face contorted with fury and something else. Fear, Elena realized. He was afraid of her. Cain stepped forward, his hybrid form rippling back into something more human, Blood ran from a dozen wounds, but his eyes burned with savage joy as he approached the immobilized Alpha. "You took everything from me," Cain said, his voice low and deadly. "My family, my pack, my home. I spent 10 years dreaming of this moment." Alistair's lips curled in a snarl. "Kill me, and my wolves will hunt you forever. Hunt her. You'll never know peace. Your wolves have submitted to their rightful queen." Cain glanced at Elena, and despite everything, the blood, the death, the chaos surrounding them, his eyes softened. "They belong to Shadowfang now." He turned back to Alistair. "But you're right about one thing. I will never know peace. Not until you're dead." Alistair's face twisted with hatred. "She'll die bearing your pups, Broken King. Her womb will—" Cain's claws flashed silver in the light streaming from Elena's body. Alistair's words ended in a wet gurgle as his throat opened, dark blood splashing across the stone floor. His body crumpled, lifeless, the fire fading from his eyes. Elena felt her power recede, the silver light dimming as the threat ended. Her knees buckled, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave, but Cain was there before she could fall, catching her, pulling her against his chest, his heart thundering beneath her ear. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over," he confirmed, his arms tightening around her. "You saved us. You saved me." Elena shook her head weakly. "We saved each other." Around them, the survivors began to stir. Shadowfang wolves helped their wounded to their feet. Alistair's former forces remained on their knees, waiting for judgment, their eyes lowered in submission to the power they'd felt emanating from Elena. She would deal with them later. For now, all she wanted was Cain's warmth and the steady rhythm of his heart and the knowledge that they had survived. Together. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of organization and healing. The dead were counted. Too many, but fewer than Elena had feared. The wounded were tended. Alistair's wolves formally submitted to Cain's authority, their pact allegiances dissolving in the face of the ancient power Elena had displayed. She moved through it all in a daze, her body exhausted but her mind strangely clear. She helped bandage wounds, murmured comfort to grieving wolves, and felt Cain's eyes on her constantly, watching her as if she might disappear. At some point, Marcus found her. The beta's face was bandaged, his arm in a sling, but he stood straight as he approached. "My lady." His voice was rough, uncertain. Elena waited. She'd noticed the change in Marcus over the past weeks. Small things at first. He'd stopped sneering when she entered rooms, started nodding to her in the corridors. During training, she'd caught him watching her practice with something other than contempt. And in the battle, she'd seen him throw himself between her and an attacking wolf, taking a slash meant for her before she'd even manifested her power. "I owe you an apology. What I said before, I was wrong. About you. About everything." He swallowed hard. "When I saw you in that battle, you could have run, could have hidden like any sane person would. Instead, you threw yourself in front of Alistair's blade for our Alpha. For us." His voice cracked slightly. "My sister died in the massacre. Cain's the only family I have left. And you saved him." Elena studied him for a long moment. "You fought for Shadowfang. For Cain. You took a wound meant for me. I fought for my pack." Marcus met her eyes, and she saw genuine respect there, hard-earned and grudging, but real. "And you are part of this pack now. Our Luna. I won't forget that again." It wasn't forgiveness, not quite, but it was a start. It was well past midnight when they finally retreated to their chambers. Their chambers now, she realized, not just his. The room had been cleaned of the morning's violence, fresh linens on the bed and a fire crackling in the hearth. Elena stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard below. Wolves still moved through the darkness, standing guard, but the frantic energy of battle had faded into something quieter, something like peace. Cain's footsteps were silent, but she felt him approach through the bond between them, a warm pressure in her chest that intensified as he drew near. "You should be resting," he said softly, stopping just behind her. "So should you." His hand settled on her shoulders, and Elena leaned back into his touch automatically. The contact sent sparks dancing across her skin, her wolf purring with satisfaction. "What you did today," Kane murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "Elena, I've never seen anything like it. That power, I don't fully understand it." She turned to face him, finding his eyes luminous in the firelight. "I don't know how to control it, or what it means, or why it only woke up now." "It woke up because of the bond." Kane's thumb traced along her jaw, tender despite the calluses that roughened his skin. "Because your wolf finally found what she was waiting for, what you were both waiting for. The power didn't need the mating mark to begin stirring, it just needed proximity to a worthy mate. Every day we spent together, every time you let me close, it was building. The mark will complete it, anchor it." But the recognition alone was enough to start the awakening. Elena's heart clenched. A mate worthy of what I carry. Is that what the first Wolves book said? The one from the library? Something like it. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar that cut through his eyebrow. It talked about bloodline compatibility, how the first wolf females could only bear children with mates strong enough to match their power. My womb isn't cursed, Kane. It was waiting. For you. For someone whose blood could match the power in mine. Kane's breath caught. "Elena, I want you to mark me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Kane went utterly still, his eyes blazing gold. "Are you certain?" His voice was rough, strained with the effort of holding himself back. "Once it's done, there's no going back. You would be bound to me, to Shadowfang, forever." "I know." Elena stepped closer, tilting her head to expose the pale column of her throat. "I want forever. I want you." Kane made a sound that was half groan, half growl. His hands slid into her hair, cradling her head as he pulled her against him. "You undo me," he breathed. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted. You've destroyed it all, and built something new in its place. Good." Elena's smile felt dangerous, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with ancient bloodlines. "Then let me destroy you a little more." He kissed her then, deep and fierce, nothing like the tentative exploration of the night before. This was claiming, possessing, a declaration of intent that left Elena breathless and wanting. His hands moved down her body, learning her curves through the thin fabric of her gown, and she arched into his touch with a moan that she didn't try to suppress. "Mine," Kane growled against her throat. "Tell me you're mine." "Yours," Elena gasped. "Always yours." He lifted her easily, carrying her to the bed and laying her down on the soft linens. The firelight played across his features as he looked down at her, and Elena saw the warrior, the alpha, the broken king who had rebuilt himself from nothing. But she also saw the man beneath it all, vulnerable and wanting and desperately in love. "I need to hear you say it." His voice was hoarse. "I need to know you want this, want me." Elena reached up and pulled him down to her. "I want you, Kane. I choose you. I choose this." He kissed her again, softer now but no less intense, and his hand found the lacing of her gown. She helped him undress her, then reached for his own clothing, needing to feel his skin against hers. When they were finally bare together, the bond between them sang with need, a golden thread drawing them closer, demanding completion. Kane's mouth traced a path down her throat, kissing, nipping, making her writhe beneath him. When he reached the junction of her neck and shoulder, he paused, his breath hot against her skin. "This will hurt," he warned. "Just for a moment." "I know." Elena tilted her head further, offering herself completely. "Do it." His fangs pierced her flesh. Pain lanced through her, sharp, bright, electric, and Elena cried out. But the pain was already transforming, shifting into something else entirely as the bond between them exploded wide open. She could feel Cain now, really feel him. His love, his fear, his desperate joy, his wolf howling with triumph. Everything he was poured into her through the mark, and she received it all. Let it fill the empty places inside her that she'd carried her entire life. Pleasure washed over her in waves, building and cresting, and she barely recognized the sounds she was making, whimpers and moans, and his name repeated like a prayer. Cain's tongue laved over the wound, sealing it, and he lifted his head to look at her with eyes that burned pure gold. "Now you," he rasped. Elena understood. This wasn't like the old stories where an alpha claimed his mate and she simply submitted. This was a joining of equals, a mutual binding, and she would not be marked without marking him in return. She rose up, pushing him onto his back with strength she didn't know she possessed. Her wolf was wild inside her now, demanding, and she could feel her own eyes glowing silver in the darkness. She straddled him, leaning down to press her lips to his throat, and felt his pulse racing beneath her tongue. "Mine," she whispered. Then she bit. Cain's roar shook the walls. His hands gripped her hips hard enough to bruise as the bond completed itself. A loop, a circle, unbroken and unbreakable. Elena felt her power surge through the connection, silver and gold intertwining, two halves of something ancient and new all at once. She licked the wound closed and pulled back to look at him. His molten eyes were wet, she realized with shock. Tears tracked down his scarred face and he made no move to hide them. "Mate," he said, the word cracking with emotion. "My mate. Yours," Elena confirmed. "And you're mine. Yours. Always. Only." They came together then, bodies joining as their souls already had, and Elena lost herself in the sensation of him. Inside her, around her, everywhere at once. The bond pulsed between them with every movement, every touch, every whispered word, until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. When they finally crested together, it was like the sun rising, brilliant and inevitable and impossibly beautiful. Afterward, they lay tangled in the ruined sheets, breathing hard, hearts racing in perfect synchronization. Elena traced idle patterns on Cain's chest, feeling the new mark she'd left on his throat, and the answering throb of the one he'd given her. "I never thought I'd have this," she murmured. "Never believed I deserved it." Cain's arm tightened around her. "You deserve everything, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." She smiled against his skin, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. The mating ceremony took place a week later, under a sky bright with late winter stars. All of Shadowfang gathered in the courtyard, the original pack members, the wolves who had submitted after Alistair's defeat, and even a few representatives from neighboring territories who had heard of the battle and come to swear alliance. Elena stood at Cain's side, wearing a gown of deep blue that matched his colors, the mating mark on her throat visible for all to see. Cain's voice rang out across the crowd as he presented her. "I give you Elena of the Nightshade bloodline, last daughter of the first wolves, savior of Shadowfang and my mate, your Luna, your queen." The howl that rose from the assembled wolves shook the very stones of the stronghold. Elena felt it wash over her, acceptance, loyalty, love, and her own wolf howled back in answer, no longer silent, no longer weak. She was home. In the months that followed, Elena's power began to settle into something she could control. The silver light came when she called it now, responding to her will rather than her fear. Cain brought her books, scrolls, anything he could find about the first wolf bloodline, and she studied them with a hunger she'd never known she possessed. She also discovered she was pregnant. The healer who examined her wept with joy. "Strong," she said, pressing her hand to Elena's still flat belly. "So strong. This child will be extraordinary." Elena placed her own hand over the healer's, feeling the tiny spark of life inside her. a spark that glowed with silver and gold intertwined. Her womb wasn't cursed. It never had been. It had simply been waiting for a mate whose blood could match the power it was meant to carry. Cain found her in the garden that evening, surrounded by early spring flowers that had pushed through the melting snow. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "The healers told you," Elena said. "They did." His hands spread across her belly, protective and reverent. "Elena, I don't have words. I don't know how to—" His voice broke. "I thought I was the last. I thought Shadowfang would die with me. And now we build something new." She turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands. Together. Cain smiled, that real smile that she still saw too rarely, and pressed his forehead to hers. "Together," he agreed. "Always together." Around them, the stronghold hummed with life and purpose. Wolves trained in the courtyard, preparing to defend their home. Builders reinforced the walls. Families planted gardens that would bloom when summer came. Shadowfang was growing, changing, becoming something stronger than it had ever been. And at its heart stood two wolves, who had both been told they were broken, worthless, cursed. They had found each other instead. Elena leaned into her mate's embrace, feeling the bond sing between them. Warm and golden and absolutely unbreakable. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled through a frozen forest with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was Luna, Queen, the last of the first wolves, reborn in silver light. She was loved, and she was finally, irrevocably, home.